The GTX 1060, which was once one of the most widely used graphics cards in the world, is an 8-year-old Pascal GPU that for the right price could still be considered relevant in 2024, depending on how you evaluate what that means. I have never reviewed the GTX 1060 on the channel by itself. However, I have used it in some budget builds and compared it with the RX 580. I thought it would be interesting to take a closer look at how it performs while I work on the next episode of the $100 Flip Up Challenge, which should be finished in the coming weeks. Released in July 2016, the GTX 1060 features the GP106 core using a 16nm process. It originally retailed for $299 US. The reference GTX 1060 has a base clock of 1506 MHz that boosts up to 709 MHz with a memory frequency of 2002 MHz. Equipped with 6GB of GDDR5 video memory, the card was well suited for its time as VRAM wasn't as much of an issue for games in the late 2010s. Its render configuration includes 1280 shading units, 80 texture mapping units, and 48 render output units. The card operates on a PCIe 3.0x16 bus interface and is power efficient with a 120W TDP, making it compatible with power supplies as low as 300 watts. Additionally, it supports modern APIs including DirectX 12 feature level 12.1. Today, the 6GB version of the GTX 1060 can easily be found on sites like eBay for around $70 to $75 US, while the less capable 3GB variant is about $15 to $20 cheaper from what I've seen. I found my Zotac 1060 Mini 6GB for $40 on Facebook Marketplace a few months ago. It's a compact unit with standard clock frequencies and specs. It also has the usual array of video outputs, including a single DVI, 1 HDMI 2.0, and 3 DisplayPort 1.4 ports. I'll discuss the GTX 1060's actual usability and relevance in 2024 after sharing some in-game tests. Theoretically, its performance aligns closely with GPUs like the RX 480, RX 580, RX 5500 XT, and the GTX 970. On paper, it even outclasses the very popular GTX 1650 in most situations. Recently, I reviewed the GTX 1050 Ti on the channel. The 1050 Ti, a step down in the Pascal lineup from the 1060, offers worse value given its similar price, less VRAM, and inferior overall performance compared to the GTX 1060. For today's testing, I'll use my GPU test bench, which consists of a Ryzen 5 5600X, 32GB of DDR4 RAM, and an NVMe SSD running Windows 10 in all games. I'll use a capture card for in-game recording, and all games will be tested at 1080p resolution. To simplify things, I'll generally use presets that provide playable frame rates while considering graphical fidelity and overall stability. The GTX 1060 still receives updated game-ready drivers, so I'll use the latest driver from 6/27/2024. To start the test, I ran the GTX 1060 in a few esports titles, beginning with Counter-Strike 2. On the high preset in Dust 2 during a bot match, I averaged around 140 to 150 FPS in most situations. There were no noticeable stutters and the overall stability was excellent. Given that the online matches are slightly less intensive than bot matches, you could expect even better frame rates, making the GTX 1060 a great choice for a high refresh rate competitive GPU for CS2, provided that you have a competent CPU. In Rainbow Six Siege, using the high preset, the benchmarking tool showed an average of 161 FPS, with no drops below 100 FPS at any point during the test. The performance was super stable overall. Next, I tested Fortnite in the performance mode with texture and view distance settings maxed out, while using 100% render resolution. This resulted in a solid graphical output, averaging a bit over 100 FPS over the course of a match. There were some occasional drops and stutters, but nothing out of the ordinary or that would detract from a decent experience. These minor issues would likely diminish over the course of a few matches. Moving on to some AAA games, I started with Cyberpunk 2077, tested at the high preset. After driving around Night City for a while, the frame rate averaged around 50 FPS, providing a good looking and stable output. In Forza Horizon 5, I used the medium preset and ran the benchmarking tool. This highly optimized title resulted in an average of 86 FPS with percentile lows in the 60s. For a racing game, this output is more than satisfactory. For a more modern game, I ran Assassin's Creed Mirage benchmark at low settings, native 1080p with TAA. The results were close to the 60 FPS sweet spot, averaging 56 FPS. In Starfield, I ran the game at low settings with 66% render resolution. In the New Atlantis area, the average frame rate was around 40 FPS. While the graphical fidelity isn't great, considering the hardware and the game's intensive nature, it's still playable and enjoyable overall. This trend continues in Baldur's Gate 3. At native 1080p and medium settings, the visual output is rough at times with less sharp textures. However, performance in the Rivington area averaged 54 FPS, and the game functioned and played perfectly fine overall. In Hogwarts Legacy, I set the settings to low at native 1080p, resulting in a fairly steady 55 FPS average in and around the castle. I noticed a lot of screen tearing, especially during broom flight, which is common in this game on budget hardware. However, it didn't significantly detract from the overall performance for this single player game. Next, I ran Horizon Forbidden West using the low preset with FSR quality. This led to a competent average frame rate in the upper 40s while maintaining solid visuals. Lastly, I tested Ghost of Tsushima at medium settings with FSR quality. At the beginning of the game, I observed a playable average of about 40 FPS with good visual quality. From what I've seen in other reviews of the GTX 1060 in this game, these settings should consistently push around 40 FPS in most of the in-game environments. After using the GTX 1060 in a variety of games, I can definitely conclude that it still offers usability even in 2024. In the titles I tested today, the 1060 was able to handle 1080p low to medium settings using upscaling only occasionally to get a few more frames. The 6GB still holds up at Full HD if you're running the lower settings, as I saw usage of around 4 to 5GB in most cases during my own testing. When it comes to whether I would recommend the 1060, things get a bit more complicated. With an abundance of these cards still hitting the used market as users upgrade to newer hardware, it may be fairly easy to find good deals on 1060s. If you can grab one for as low as $50 to $60 at least one of the 6GB versions, I think it's still a great value and would be ideal for older titles and esports while still being capable of running some newer AAA games at much lower settings. If you value a card that could run newer games at higher settings or want something a little bit more modern but still on the budget side, a few recommendations I have would be the GTX 1660 Super, 1660 Ti, and the GTX 1060. From AMD, I would also recommend the 5600 XT and 5700 XT. All these cards come in around $100 to $150 from what I've seen. Anyways, I hope this video was informative on where the 1060 stands 8 years later. I plan to finish the next episode of the $100 flip-up challenge in the coming weeks and continue to make that series a big focus for the channel. If you want to follow along with that or see other budget PC hardware reviews and tests like this one, consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't already. If you have any personal experiences with the GTX 1060 or other alternative recommendations or any questions or suggestions, don't hesitate to leave a comment. Thank you.